Hi, and welcome to part two of our discussion of chapter two from American Media History, the Press and the Revolution. So in this segment, we're going to talk about voices on the road to revolution. In other words, who were those representing the Tories, the Whigs, and the Patriots in the press? Because they were the ones really who swayed public opinion and moved the colonists all over the colonies to believe that rebellion, that revolution was a good idea. So we'll start with the Tories. Just to remind you, they were the ones who were loyal to Britain. They believed in the governing system that had been in place in England for centuries, that is, governing by property, heredity, position, and tradition. The representative of the Tory position in the colonies in the press was James Rivington, editor of Rivington's New York Gazetteer. So he actually was neutral. He believed that he should be neutral as a printer and present balanced coverage of the possible revolution. He wanted to present both sides of the debate. The Sons of Liberty, who were perhaps the most radical wing of the Patriot Party, weren't impressed, and they destroyed his shop, they destroyed his press. He went back to England, but returned within 2 years, and wielding the same kind of sword that the Sons of Liberty had used against him, that is, blistering attacks on anyone who favored the revolution. So George Washington, Ethan Allen, anybody who he considered to be rebel, he went after and created all kinds of trouble and scandal. The Whigs, as you recall, were the capitalist class. So these were the men who were interested in maintaining their economic position and power. They were mildly opposed to the Tories because the capitalist system doesn't actually fit very well with the aristocratic view that the Tories held. But they were pretty much on the fence up until the beginning of the revolution. They wanted to see which way the wind would blow and what would bring the most benefit to them, to their economic position. The Whig Voice was not a publisher or not an editor, but he wrote a number of letters to the newspapers. His name was John Dickinson. He lived in Pennsylvania. He was a lawyer. And he wrote anonymously against the Townshend Acts of 1767. These were incredibly difficult for the colonies to accept. This is where the whole issue of glass and tea and so forth, but many other things happened as well as a result of the Townshend Act, and he strongly opposed it. The reason he was important as a voice is that he moved his peers, that is the businessmen and the merchants, to question the British taxation policies and convince them that they were unfair and in fact against the Whig economic interests. In addition, the fact that he was writing from Pennsylvania indicated that the revolutionary ideas were passing away solely from the hotbeds of Massachusetts and New York and expanding to include the other colonies. Now, the Patriots were the third party, and these were the ones who sought radical social change. So they had a social agenda. It wasn't about economics, and it certainly wasn't about tradition. The first voice that we'll talk about is Isaiah Thomas. As a young man in his early 20s, he established the Massachusetts Spy. He, like Rivington, wanted to present multiple or neutral points of view and be neutral. He wanted to be balanced, but he soon became a radical. His contact with Samuel Adams led him in the direction of revolution, and so he used his newspaper for that purpose. He was very well educated, extremely articulate, and his newspaper was of a higher quality than any of the contemporaries. Therefore, his voice became very clear, and many people listened to what Isaiah Thomas had to say. Samuel Adams is one of the most important characters in the Patriot wing of politics. He's called the master of puppets, and the reason for that is because he was a master of manipulation. He didn't really have much regard for the truth. He would talk about anything and write about anything that he felt would bring revolution. So he used the Boston Gazetteer. It wasn't a newspaper that he owned, but he used that as a way to lay out his own radical philosophy. He too wrote against the Townsend Acts, but his goal was to whip up emotion and to get people to want to rebel against such tyranny. Based on the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts, he believed that when a government ignored the basic rights of the colonies, the contract that bound them together was no longer applied. I hope that you're hearing echoes of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. He felt that if the Parliament ignored the basic rights of the colonies, they had a right to overthrow the Parliament, to overthrow Britain. And so that was part of his justification for leading to revolution. So his ideas were based on John Locke. He also believed in a government that was had a system of checks and balances with three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. So I hope you can see the foreshadowings of our own United States Constitution. Sam Adams led the core revolutionary group called the Sons of Liberty. And what he did was establish what he called committees of correspondence throughout many towns in Massachusetts. He had his representatives go to these meetings and then send back to him any information, important things that had occurred at the meetings. Therefore, he set up what's come to be called the first news bureau. Now, we have news bureaus today all around the world. You might think of Associated Press or CNN or one of those. So this is a precursor to that. It began in Massachusetts, but later became intercolonial. Now, what's important about this is that Adams used the Journal of Occurrences to greatly inflate events to bring about the desire for revolution among the colonists. The things like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, which, by the way, was staged by the Sons of Liberty, and the Intolerable Acts were all things that he used to whip up resentment against the crown. Now, the Sons of Liberty decided that they were going to keep an eye on Governor Gage. One thing that had happened with the Townsend Act is that the crown appointed the governors in the colonies. They said that if Gage got to be too high-handed and too unfair, that they were going to go after him and try to depose him. Gage got wind of this and wanted to arrest Adams and John Hancock and send them back to England to hang. And the plan was for these two to be arrested at Lexington. It was the Sons of Liberty, of whom Paul Revere was one, who warned Adams and Hancock about the issue, the desire for their arrest and the fact that they were going to be arrested at Lexington. And it was this that began the revolution, the shot heard round the world, if you will. It was the beginning of the revolution at the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775, the day the revolution began. Now, another person I want you to be familiar with, if you're not, is Thomas Paine. He actually doesn't get a lot of attention in traditional American history, but he actually is known as the godfather of the American nation. Some people would point to Benjamin Franklin, some people would point to Thomas Jefferson, others would point to George Washington. But when it comes down to advocating for political change, for arguments that moved the common person, it was Thomas Paine. He wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he condemned monarchy and encouraged soldiers to fight for independence. These were called the Crisis Papers. Thomas Paine was the first to use the name United States of America. And in addition to his tremendous articulation of the democratic political philosophy, he also was a man many years ahead of his time. He believed in emancipation for women. He believed in elder care, of all things. We're not even that crazy about that idea today in the United States. He was an abolitionist some 100 years before abolition actually occurred. And he also envisioned something similar to the League of Nations, which was a precursor in the early 20th century to the United Nations. So as you know, It took a document to explain the rationale for independence from Britain, and this document was written by Thomas Jefferson and edited by Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Adams. It was published on July 4th, 1776, and its goal was to explain why the break from Britain was reasonable and just. It emphasized many of the ideas from John Locke, and those that had been articulated by Thomas Paine and others. It emphasized the consent of the governed and the right of the people to overthrow an oppressive government. The Continental Congress had a Pennsylvania printer named John Dunlap print broadsides of the document and send them all over the colonies. So whereas the war had been unpopular in the colonies, it was the Declaration of Independence that began really to declare their dependence and convince the colonists of the willingness to fight. The war was unpopular, certainly with the British, and that is probably why they lost. They didn't see the need for it, and being sent to the American colonies to fight against the Revolution was considered kind of a bad thing for a British soldier. So in the next segment, we'll take up a discussion of newspapers and more talk about why they were important as a revolutionary force, and then conclude with the impact of the revolution on newspapers.